Hi there, I'm Jane Ward, co-chair of the Programming Committee of Friends of the Edgewater Library. We're thrilled you're joining us for today's program, the top 10 events in Chicago baseball history. Welcome to all our baseball fans calling in from Chicago and the Chicago area, as well as from Colorado, Maryland, and Washington, D.C. We have a few more Cubs fans than White Sox fans joining us today. Some of you, though, are both Cubs and White Sox fans. And then that's nice work, sending love to both our Chicago teams. We also have fans here today of the St. Louis Cardinals, the Boston Red Sox, and the New York Yankees. Before we jump into the presentation, I have a few things to go through. Could you please click on the chat bubble and open your chat bar? This is where we'll communicate with and where you can contact our hosts with any questions you have. And please watch for notices from us. If you're a fan of a team I haven't mentioned or are visiting from another state that I haven't mentioned, please share that information in the chat function when you care to. While you're doing that, I'm going to run through a few more pieces of procedure. Please turn off or silence your cell phones and other devices while you're attending the event. At the start of the program, you'll notice that Friends of the Edgewater Library has muted you. This courtesy eliminates audio and video interruptions to our programs. We'll unmute you when there's a need to do so. We'll also be recording this program for playback on the Friends website. By registering, you've given Friends of the Edgewater Library permission to use your image and voice as a part of the recording and its future use online. Today's guest speaker, Kevin Kaufmann, will take questions at the end of the talk. Please type your questions into the chat box and hit enter to send them. During the Q&A period, I will be asking the questions on your behalf. Once the program is ended, however, we will unmute you all so you can chat directly with Kevin for a few minutes. This is your chance to show off your team apparel or memorabilia, so please stay on Zoom after the program has wrapped. Also, at the start of the free period, we will post a program evaluation poll. We would appreciate if everyone would take a few seconds to answer the 3 multiple choice questions. Your feedback is helpful to us as we continue to plan. Now, about those program plans, you may know that the library will reopen on June 8th, but for the time being, Friends programs will continue virtually. We're excited to be able to offer programs via Zoom because it helps us all stay connected to our library family when we can't meet in person. But no matter how we continue to connect with you, the Friends mission remains the same: to support the library, its staff, and its programming by raising supplemental funds, and to promote the library as a vital resource in our community. If you are interested in helping the Friends help the library, you can do this by joining our group for as little as $10 a year. Please visit our website for more information on how you can participate in our organization. You'll find our web address soon in the chat bar. That was my warm-up. Now let's get into the main event. Kevin Kaufmann, PhD, is a staff member and part-time instructor at Loyola University Chicago. Kevin's teaching focuses on U.S. history with emphasis on the cultural history of our country and what's more particular to American culture than baseball, and what's more particular to Chicago's history than its 2 baseball teams. Today, Kevin will share what he considers are the top 10 events in Chicago baseball history. He wrote in his program notes, "Chicago has a great attachment to the game of baseball. From the beginnings of Chicago's first professional team in the 1870s until the present day, baseball has been a part of the fabric of the city." He'll regale us with both highlights and lowlights, and all the events will be fascinating to Chicago history buffs and sports fans alike. Please join me in welcoming Kevin Kaufmann. Kevin, thank you for joining us today, and I turn the program off to you.
Thank you very much, Jane. Hope everybody can hear me. Everything going well. Again, as Jane said, my name is Kevin Kaufmann. I work at Loyola. I also got my PhD at Loyola, so I have a strong Chicago connection with Loyola and living here. But I didn't grow up here. I grew up around Cleveland, Ohio. And you may be wondering, how did I get in touch with Chicago baseball? And well, I was a Cleveland Indians fan growing up, and then I moved to Chicago, and I worked at Wrigley Field for 3 years, which made me a Chicago White Sox fan. So I kind of went completely to the dark side, as my father and brother like to tell me. I still, every baseball season, am called a traitor by my dad, especially when the White Sox are doing good. So I haven't had to worry about that too much lately. But looking at the history of Chicago and the history of baseball, I taught a course on this at the Newberry, which was a lot of fun, and it was a seminar, and I've done presentations like this too. And I started with just calling it the history of Chicago, the history of baseball in Chicago, and I would get going so much on various topics that I wound up usually finishing like right about 1920, which isn't really much of the history of Chicago baseball that especially a lot of people want to hear about, you know, completely missing, well, present day, the goings on of the 1950s and 60s and stuff like that, and a lot of other events too. So I boiled it down to, well, if there were 10 things I feel like you need to know about Chicago and baseball and its tie to the game and its history, what would they be? And that's where I came up with this. Now, is it, I don't, you know, it's one historian's interpretation of the top 10 events in baseball in Chicago. Your mileage may vary, as people say. But I feel like these not only are important in the sport, but there's a lot of cultural stuff here that gets teased out that I think is one of the great things, as Jane kind of alluded to in her introduction. Baseball and American history go hand in hand. If you want to know about, you know, captains of industry and robber barons, that's baseball. If you want to know about labor strife, that's baseball. If you want to know about challenges to race and problems of racism, that's baseball. And there's, you know, it's definitely the urban game as the United States really came into its own. So there's a lot of things that parallel really nicely when talking about baseball and history in the United States. It is as, and I'll be throwing in little quotes as they pop into my head, but it is, as Walt Whitman said, baseball is our game. And I think that's, you know, even though its background comes from England and a lot of different influences, you don't find a lot of places outside of the United States participating for a long time until, well, later on into the 20th century. But I'm getting all crazy already. So let's get into the top 10 events and let me get to my presentation. And here we go. Baseball in Chicago. There we go. And starting with event number 1 is, if I can, is the founding of the National League. It is the oldest professional league in the United States. It was founded in 1876, and I mentioned that I worked for the Chicago Cubs, and it was really cool to get a pay stub every 2 weeks that said Chicago's Baseball Club, founded 1876. And it was really kind of neat sort of thing for a person into history to get that little thing every week. Of course, I didn't keep any of the pay stubs, but what do you do? But the National League does come into existence in 1876. There had been professional baseball before this. The first professional baseball team that many of you probably know was the Cincinnati Red Stockings. And they were a professional team, and they did more along the lines of a barnstorming kind of circuit. So they would play, and they would play other semi-professional or professional teams. But there wasn't anything as structured as the National League when it is founded in 1876, and it has been going ever since, with very minor interruptions here and there. The first team is the National League team of Chicago, which was not called the Cubs. It was called, I know this may shock some people, but of course, if you're here, you probably know this stuff already, maybe, but they were the Chicago White Stockings. The first team with A.G. Spalding on that team, who was going to become a famous sporting goods manufacturer and also very influential in baseball and baseball history. The first team owner is William Hulbert, whose picture is right there up on the screen, and that is the first C that I could find anyway that they used in their uniforms as well. Hulbert here in Chicago is going to have a great deal of influence on the league and designing it and who is going to be a part of it and who isn't. Some of the strict rules of the National League, such as no Sunday baseball and no alcohol in the stands. If you can imagine Wrigley Field with no Sunday sunshine and no alcohol, I think that would be hard to imagine these days. But the team name is going to evolve. As it says there, 1902 is when it comes to the Cubs, but it goes through a few other changes. They're going to be called the Chicago Colts for a while, when their very famous manager, Cap Anson, who I'll mention in just a minute, a little bit more detail, is let go by the team. They are called the Orphans in the press. So they're the Chicago Orphans for a short period of time. And the press is also going to have a hand in naming the Cubs. They're going to be referred to as Bear Cubs when they're practicing on the field, and a reporter is going to hear that and say, wow, that's a great name. And in 1902, that's the name that sticks and has been with the team ever since. Other teams kind of do that too. There was a bit of a trade kerfuffle between the team from Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, and the Philadelphia papers referred to those pirates from Pittsburgh of stealing their player. And well, there you go. And other teams, my hometown, Cleveland, will go through various name changes too, largely from the press, until they will have a poll in the local newspaper to decide on what the team's name should be. But that's how the Cubs get to be the Cubs. And that really is a very important part of how baseball comes to Chicago and the center place that it's going to have. This is the first of 4 leagues that are founded here in Chicago, with very strong ties to the city of Chicago, and we'll get to those in just a minute. The second important thing, or significant thing in the history of baseball and in Chicago, is that player that I mentioned, Cap Anson. He was a very successful player manager for the Chicago White Sox through the 1880s and into the 1890s. He is going to win 5 pennants, and at this point, there's no real World Series. At some point, the National League will compete with the American Association, which was an older league. They call it the World Series, but most people define the World Series as starting in 1903, when the American and National League start to compete for the year-end trophy. But he is going to be a very, very successful manager. But in 1883, he will refuse to take the field when a team from Toledo is fielding a player of African-American descent. In 1883, eventually the game will get played. However, the same issue comes up in 1884, and this time Anson does not budge. By the 1890s, and this is right at the height of the establishment of Jim Crow throughout much of the United States and de facto segregation in many parts. It is in the 1890s that this is established, as they like to call it, the gentleman's agreement. Now, it's not very gentlemanly at all, but the idea that no African American should play in professional quote unquote white leagues. The last player to do it is that player from Toledo. His name was Moses Fleetfoot Walker. And from the time he last played, and eventually he couldn't play anywhere, even though he wanted to keep playing. He was basically blackballed from the league. But from the time of his last game until Jackie Robinson comes to baseball in 1947, there will be no African Americans competing in American organized baseball. And that does go through the minor leagues. It's not just the major leagues. It is basically throughout the structure of baseball that is going to occur. At various times, there's going to be other attempts to desegregate baseball that won't go through and until 1947 and Jackie Robinson breaks the color line. But Cap Anson had a great amount of influence in getting that color line firmly established. And it's one of, as I mentioned, kind of, or as Jane mentioned in the introduction, it's one of those moments in baseball history that maybe we'd like to forget, but I don't think we should, because this is the kind of thing that we need to always keep in mind and remember. The next event that I think, and we're just finally getting to the 20th century, is the founding of the American League. This is going to be, as many people saw it in 1901, yet another attempt to start a rival league to the National League. As I mentioned, the American Association was a rival league for a while. There was going to be something called the Western League, which is where the American League sort of picks up the remnants and will form its own league. The Western League, of course, not extending beyond St. Louis, but it's always interesting. One of the great things about Chicago history in general is how this was the Great West, in a sense. We have Northwestern, and the Western Golf Association, and all these little things still connecting Chicago to the idea of being the western reaches of the United States. And that always, I like to think of that period of time and the idea that, wow, if you would have told people then, we're going to be able to travel in less than a day to the Pacific Ocean, they would have just completely, they just wouldn't have believed you, I think is the best way to say it. But the founding of the American League is going to turn out to be very successful. Like the American Association back in the 1880s, they are going to kind of go after the National League in places where they weren't, but also have a little bit freer rules, even though the restrictions on alcohol and Sunday baseball had kind of left the National League by then, but some places still was in place. The American League is going to be much more kind of open to that kind of thing as well. It is going to be started by a reporter from Cincinnati, of all places, where there never has been an American League team, is going to start structuring the league from teams in the old Western League, and his name was Ban Johnson. He is going to recruit an old player that he was friends with by the name of Charles Comiskey, and you have their two pictures right there. Ban has the awesome bow tie and alfalfa hair, and Charles Comiskey wearing his hat and kind of his almost go-to look with that hat. And if you have ever been to Guaranteed Rate Field and you see his statue, it looks more like a bowler on the statue, but he always seems to be pictured with some kind of fedora or something along those lines. But Charles Comiskey is going to want to be a part of the league as well. And he will take a team from Sioux Falls and move it to St. Paul for one season with an eye towards getting it in Chicago to be a part of the larger cities in the United States. He will get help from Ban Johnson to relocate his team, negotiating with the owner of the National League team. And they will be able to come to Chicago. However, this is one of the more interesting things I've found about this agreement, is that the new American League Chicago baseball team cannot establish or cannot move beyond 35th Street. So they cannot come further north than 35th Street. Interestingly enough, that when they build Comiskey Park in 1910, it is located right at 35th Street. So they tried to get as close to downtown as they could, but not quite can't go much further, and they respected that. The other fun fact, and something that I always found an interesting bit, is that I mentioned that the White Stockings were the original name of the Cubs, and in order to kind of rekindle those thoughts, it was Comiskey's direct intention to use that name, and he has a play on words and goes with White Sox, and it didn't lead to, well, maybe as much confusion as he had hoped, but it was kind of a nostalgic look back, as it were, in trying to get people to come and check out the new team. The Cubs and White Sox will be fairly successful in this period of time in baseball. If you fast forward only a few years to 1906, and the World Series is David versus Goliath. You have the Cubs as Goliath, who are one of the winningest teams ever in baseball history. If you go by winning percentage, they still are the top team in baseball history with 116 wins and 36 losses. And they face off against the 93 and 58 White Sox. It is all here within Chicago. It is all played over the course of a week. Since there are no travel dates that they have to figure in, they alternate days and go from one park to the other, and just keep it all condensed. The series started on October 9th, and they played straight through when they were finished. Even since it didn't go the full 7 games, it didn't even go till the 16th. It would wind up going 6 games, with the White Sox, of all things, coming out on top. It is very interesting, especially if you've attended baseball games, I would say in the last 15 to 20 years. The longest game in this World Series was 2 hours and 18 minutes. There were 3 of the games that didn't even go 2 hours. I mean, that if you remember Mark Burley for the White Sox, that's beyond Mark Burley pitching speed. We are clipping right through those games. That is really something else. Admittedly, I love when games only go 2.5 hours. Watching, no offense to our Yankee and Boston Red Sox fans, but watching those playoff games between those two teams ranging at 4+ hours, I tell you, it makes a baseball fan have to work for it, that's for sure. Anyway, the White Sox win the inter-city series. It is the only time that the two Chicago teams have faced off in the World Series. Unlike other areas, well, really only one area of the country, New York, we have not had a great deal of inner-city even scares of both teams making the playoffs at the same time and possibly being in the series at the same time. I'm trying to think of when that may have actually been, when both teams were in the playoffs at the same time, and I can't come up with it on top of my head. I'm sure somebody in the chat can give us a quick search. But that 1906 Cubs team is going to basically be the same team in 1907, which is going to win the World Series, and the 1908 World Series champions, which is going to be the last time the Cubs win the World Series until, of course, just a few years ago. The 1908 series has the Cubs defeating the Detroit Tigers, and it is right around that time, as you can see here up on your screen, baseball's sad lexicon, the poem that immortalized Tinkers to Evers to Chance. These are the saddest possible words, Tinkers to Evers to Chance. Trio of bear cubs and fleeter than birds, Tinkers and Evers and Chance. ruthlessly pricking our gonfalon bubble, making a giant hit into a double. Words that are heavy with nothing but trouble, tinkers to Evers to Chance. And I feel that that poem helped get all three of those guys into the Hall of Fame. They were all very good players, don't get me wrong, but never hurts to have a poem written about you as far as making your case to become immortalized in baseball history. What's interesting is the three of them didn't particularly get along all that well, even though their names are linked and they were a formidable infield during their time. But they weren't really all that close of friends. And like I said, this is going to be the last World Series that the Cubs win for quite some time, and there they are. I've always wondered what they're looking to in that angle portrait, but anyway. And then we'll go get to these guys in just a minute. Let's stay with the positive for just a second. But the Cubs, the thing that it's interesting, the Cubs become known as lovable losers come really into the 1940s and 50s. But really leading up to that, the Cubs were a very good baseball team. They're going to make the World Series in 1910, 1918, 1929, 1935, 1938, 1945, and then there's going to be a little drought. But I know many baseball fans across the various teams to have that kind of, in about a 20, 30-year span, would love to have reached the World Series that many times. And it's very interesting that in two of those World Series, there is a young fellow and then, an older fellow, same guy. Babe Ruth is part of two of those Cubs losses. In 1918, a young phenom pitcher, Babe Ruth, is going to have one of the longest scoreless inning streaks in World Series history in 1918. And he is going to stymie the Cubs, and the Red Sox will go on to win their last World Championship until 2004. But another interesting note about that 1918 World Series, I knew it was in one of the World Series. I couldn't remember which, so I looked it up actually this morning. But because of the size of the Cubs' home park, which at the time was still called Wiegand Field, they asked the White Sox if they could use their much larger, newer baseball, well, not newer, but baseball palace, as it were, Comiskey Park for the World Series. And what I didn't know was that the same thing happened in Boston. The Boston Red Sox, because their park was smaller than the Boston Braves field, asked that for the World Series, could we use your larger park? So just think of that for one quick second. Neither team played in their home park for the World Series. And again, kind of fast forwarding to the present day, could you imagine not playing the World Series in Wrigley Field and Fenway Park? I think the Baseball Network, baseball television folks would just go absolutely bananas if you tried to propose such a thing. I mean, Wrigley, Fenway are stars in their own right. But in 1918, they weren't big enough and they changed venue. The other instance where Babe Ruth comes in is in 1932. And that is the famous called shot here in Chicago in Wrigley Field, where Babe Ruth pointed somewhere. Many people, there's been many debates about whether or not it happened in this sort of thing and where was he pointing and who was he yelling at. Sometimes you can't let history get in the way of a good story. And this is one of those times. Babe Ruth definitely was being razzed all day. And he definitely, I think, pointed somewhere. Now, did he point at the Cubs bench? Did he point to somebody out in right field? Don't know. But it sure did look cool after he did make that gesture and then hit a home run. Now, of course, you were a Cubs fan, probably not so much. But of all the myths and legends of Babe Ruth, that's probably one of the most enduring that there's ever been. It's been highlighted in films. It's been seen all over. Now, let's move on to another kind of dark chapter in baseball history. That would be the 1919 World Series. Now, if it weren't for the series, can you still hear me? Okay. If it weren't for the 1919 World Series, we'd probably be remembering the 1917 team, which was basically the same team. Many of the same players were on it. They were a very good team. They defeated the always troublesome New York Giants that dominated much of baseball through the 19aughts and 10s and 20s. But 1919, of course, does happen. Now, it is when the Chicago White Sox are implicated in fixing the World Series against the Cincinnati Reds. It is a best of 9 World Series, which is a bit of an anomaly. This format's only going to last until 1922. Best of 7 is seen as the right number. Best of 9 seemed to be kind of too much of a good thing. And there is, what we know about the fix is this, is that it was an agreement between the players and gamblers to throw the games. With each loss, the players would each receive $5,000. Now, the ringleader seems to be a player by the name of Chick Gandil. He was a pretty good player, played a decent first base. He was a lifetime .277 hitter. And the gamblers were relatively not famous, except for the gentleman I have there pictured on the screen. His name is Arnold Rothstein. He is often seen as kind of the name they had to get in order for this to continue. Kind of like needing a named, a famous person in order to make this get off the ground. And on the player side, it was kind of the same thing too, that many of the gamblers, including Rothstein, felt that if they didn't have Joe Jackson, shoeless Joe Jackson, as part of this conspiracy, it wasn't going to happen. Joe Jackson is indeed part of the players who decide to throw the World Series, and there is a lot of debate as to there's still debate about was he in on it, wasn't he, that sort of thing. It's pretty clear that he did take the money after the first loss. He got his payment, and even though there is some discussion of him trying to return it, it's one of those things of, well, after you've committed the crime, it doesn't really look good. Just for some context too, and there is a certain amount of, especially from the film 8 Men Out, that Comiskey, the owner of the White Sox, was cheap and didn't pay the players fairly and things of that nature. The Chicago White Sox of that era were one of the best paid teams in baseball. Now, what that compares to, say, what other people were making, things like that, that's a whole other discussion. But as far as their peers, the White Sox were doing pretty good. However, as I said, for each loss, they would get paid $5,000. Joe Jackson got paid $6,000 for the entire season. So Chick Gandil, just to give you another context, was paid $4,000 for the entire season. So you can kind of see where $5,000 per game that we lose, that's hard to probably turn down. Not saying that it's right by any stretch, but it definitely leads to how this could be very tempting. And it should be mentioned too that betting on baseball and gambling in baseball was rampant during this time. So as the series goes on, the gamblers that were working with the players, the people actually giving them the money, stop giving them the money.
They said, well, all the cash we had on hand is out on bets. We promise to make it up to you as soon as the series is over. The players, they didn't really buy that. And they start to try and win the games. There is threats of violence against some of the players. In the film, there is a hint that some of the players and their families were being threatened. There isn't really any evidence of that. There was evidence of them threatening the players, but as far as trying to scare them with their family members and things like that, that was added for dramatic tension, I think is the best way to describe it. So the White Sox wind up losing the World Series. And according to many, even in 1919, it was possibly the worst kept secret in baseball. Many people felt that something was off. There were rumors swirling all around. And this is, of course, in the era before even television and anything like that, let alone social media. And many people felt something was off. Two Chicago sports writers, while watching the games, and this is portrayed in the film as well, did make notations on their scorecards. Anything that they found suspicious, they put a note by it. And as they looked at the losses, they definitely felt something was up. Now, if 8 Men Out is kind of your window into this, it feels like it's it coming to court and being tried and that sort of thing all happened very fast. And turns out the 1920 season actually continues with all of those players still playing. The White Sox are in first place for much of 1920, the same team from 1919. And they are going through this legal battle at the same time, but they are still playing baseball. It's during this time that one of the great Chicago mysteries unfolds of the grand jury testimony of the players, and some evidence mysteriously goes missing during their trial. And all of the players are acquitted in great Chicago jurisprudence fashion. Unfortunately for the players, baseball decided that in order to kind of show that they're cleaning up the game and getting tough on gambling and vice and all that kind of stuff, they appoint a commissioner, a person by the name of Kennesaw Mountain Landis. He will insist on having very broad powers, including being able to make decisions on the best interest of baseball. And it is his idea that regardless of what the court case says, these 8 men should be banned forever from organized baseball. And that's where we get the name 8 Men Out. I do love this headline, fix these faces in your memory. And they do kind of look like mugshots if you get right down to it. That's fair. But they will never be a part of organized baseball again. The names, Chick Gandil, of course, Joe Jackson, Happy Felsch, Buck Weaver, Lefty Williams, Eddie Seacott, Fred McMullen, and Swede Risberg, or Risberg. Of them all, Buck Weaver probably has the best case to be reinstated. He never took any payments. He just knew that the plot was going on. His great crime was not turning in his fellow players. And that, according to Landis, was enough to get him a lifetime ban. That seems to be a bit harsh, to be completely honest. He, along with members of his family after he passes away, have continued to try and get him reinstated into baseball. On to Joe Jackson, who was probably the most famous of these players during the time. Of course, he had the great nickname of Shoeless Joe. And he was a fantastic player. He is the only baseball player ever to hit over 400, which batting average, and not win the batting title, just to give you some idea of how good he was, and of course, how much better Ty Cobb could be. Also, I think it was Ty Cobb who said of him, that is the place where triples go to die, referring to him and his fielding prowess. So he was destined for the Hall of Fame for sure when the Hall of Fame comes into existence. And of course, he is banned from baseball. He tries a few times to play in the minor leagues, tries to play in some semi-professional things, and eventually he is found out and politely asked to leave. There is a bit of a myth about Joe Jackson, that he died like a broken man, and was destitute and things of that nature. And that's really not true. He went back to his native South Carolina and opened a string of successful businesses. One was a laundromat, one was a liquor store. At one point, a fellow Southerner came through, Ty Cobb again, and met him. And there's a famous story that Ty is there talking to him and then finally says, Joe, don't you recognize me? Why won't you say hello? And Joe said, oh, gosh, Ty, I didn't think you'd want to speak to me. And they, of course, managed to talk about the old days and all that kind of good stuff, water under the bridge and such. But he was embarrassed by his past in that regard. That is true. But the idea that he was broke and, just cast aside, he actually managed to do okay. Now, next. Right around that same time, and the founding of yet another league here in Chicago, and that was the founding of the Negro National League. This is a direct response into a period of time in Chicago and American history called the Great Migration, when hundreds of thousands of African-American Southerners move north to the industrial cities of the North for job opportunities and social opportunities and political opportunities in northern cities. Chicago was one of the main stops on the Great Migration, especially in what I would term the first migration from about 1914 until the mid-1920s. It will slow down for a while in the 20s. This is the migration. And then when World War II hits, the migration will ramp right back up again, to the point where over 3 million African Americans will leave the South and go to various cities throughout, first the industrial Northeast, Midwest, and then World War II, many African Americans moved west. But it radically changes the makeup of American cities, the demographics of American cities, and just how everything is kind of thought of in American cities and designed. And it's from that and what many African Americans do, because segregation is still such a part of American culture at this point, is that African Americans will set up their own institutions. Most famously, African Americans will start their own insurance companies, their own funeral parlors, their own banking, their own press. Famously, the Chicago Defender, which is a stalwart of the African American press. And along those same lines, baseball. They will create their own baseball league. And the founder of this league his name is Rube Foster. And he starts a barnstorming team called the Chicago American Giants. And much like those teams prior to the National League, barnstorming is great, but it's not as competitive as perhaps people would like to watch and participate in. So in 1920, Rube starts the Negro National League. And it is a collection of teams throughout really the upper Midwest, consisting again of the Chicago American Giants. And then there's the Chicago Giants, the Detroit Stars, the Kansas City Monarchs, the Dayton Marcos, the Indianapolis ABCs, the St. Louis Giants, a lot of Giants in this, and the Cuban Stars, which were actually from Cincinnati. Eventually, they will create their own World Series that competes against teams from the East, and it will become kind of the precursor to what will become a very famous game that will be played in Comiskey Park for 2 decades, called the East-West game, which was the Negro League All-Star game. And every year that would be played in Chicago. And it was one of the biggest events on the African-American calendar every year. And the Negro Leagues will really thrive through the 1920s. They will stop for just about a year. And then another African-American, this time in Pittsburgh, will have a strong voice in kind of resurrecting the Negro National League and creating a much stronger league through the 30s and into the 40s. And it will last until the 1950s when, after baseball is integrated, the Negro Leagues will not be able to survive after a while. There'll be very, very little compensation from major league teams taking players from Negro League teams, and making ends meet becomes harder and harder until finally they do go away. But it's really important to think of the historic legacy of those teams. It was one of those things that highlighted also the hypocrisy of segregation, especially in baseball, because many of these teams, as mentioned, the East-West game was played on a white quote unquote field. Many of these teams rented space in major league stadiums, so they could play in the same places and many times play against major league teams, major league all-star teams, and yet they were not allowed to play as part of the same team. And it eventually, of course, will change, but it just still takes a long time. And this is a means of demonstrating how this change really should come about. Sadly, Rube Foster does not see much of this. He passes away in 1930 as a relatively young man. He was only 51. But by 1926, he was suffering from bad health and also bad mental health. He was having delusions and also paranoia. He will become hospitalized in 1926, and he will go in and out of hospitalization, eventually dying, like I said, when he was 51 in 1930. So kind of a sad end to his chapter, but he started something that was quite amazing. That is where I also caught the baseball bug. That's where I got my master's. I did my master's thesis on a team called the Pittsburgh Crawfords, because I took a baseball class long ago where the professor said quite possibly the best baseball team ever was the Pittsburgh Crawfords. And I was like, well, I've never heard of them. And well, then I started going down these baseball rabbit holes ever since. So the next thing is actually the founding of yet another league as far as important events. And that is the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League. This is started by Philip K. Wrigley. Yes, that same Wrigley. Gum magnate and owner of the Chicago Cubs. It is started as, a means of satisfying people's desire to have baseball. There is a shortage of players for Major League Baseball and the minor league baseball because, well, there's a war going on. And also, this also ties very interestingly into the whole idea of women going into the workforce. I should have put up a picture of Rosie the Riveter as that image of women entering into the workforce, and why not enter into baseball? It turns out to be a very successful league until the 1950s, when finding places to play and interest does wane when Major League Baseball gets back to its kind of normal operations. But it was very well received. It did last over a decade. And interestingly enough, even though Wrigley does create the league and has a strong hand in designing it, including, as you can see there, the uniforms of women in skirts playing baseball, there's only one very short-lived Chicago team. What were they called? The Chicago Colleens. And they only lasted for about a year. The most successful team was the Rockford Peaches. They were immortalized in in a very fun movie, A League of Their Own. This is definitely one of the points when, if I was in front of an actual audience, I would ask you, what is the one rule that we learn from this movie? And that there is no crying in baseball. And I always find that to be I still love watching that movie. But the Rockford Peaches will win the league 4 different times, competing against various other teams. Mostly it's centered around the Midwest. It goes into Michigan, South Bend, and also Wisconsin, but doesn't really branch out much beyond the Midwest. But still, it has its own place in the Baseball Hall of Fame, and it definitely shows that women could and should play baseball. Of course, there'll be other leagues. There's currently a women's baseball league still functioning, and so there's definitely a legacy there too. And again, it shows Chicago's place in all of this history, as a center of baseball fandom, where these things can take root. Now then, number 9, the World Series that to some people seems not to have happened. As you can see here on this photo, this was on Sports Center, talking about the championships since 1965. Chicago is listed here. This is before 2016, with the Bulls and the Blackhawks and the Bears. And of course, there is one conspicuously missing, and that would be the White Sox in 2005. This would not be the only time that ESPN forgot to mention that the White Sox indeed won the World Series in 2005. As mentioned here on the notes, Jermaine Dye is named the MVP. It was a 4-0 sweep of the Houston Astros, which, when the Astros way back when were part of the National League. It's kind of interesting now to see the White Sox play the Astros every season, and kind of think, wait, it wasn't that long ago, was it? But it's actually getting to be a bit long ago for those of us who were fans and enjoying that World Series. The White Sox came in with a 99-67 record, which was quite good. And many people didn't even expect them to do quite as well as they did. I think it's a testament to Ozzie Guillen and his use of pitchers and things like that. A little bit of luck. For instance, perhaps a ball was dropped, perhaps it wasn't. AJ Pierzynski still isn't talking. That was in the playoffs, of course. Bringing in a quite old veteran with bases loaded and nobody out in Fenway Park against the Red Sox, and somehow getting all 3 outs with no run scoring. So there was a lot of serendipity for that championship team. Of course, this wouldn't be complete without mentioning the 2016 World Championship of the Cubs. Now, I am a White Sox fan, but I'm also a historian, and not winning for over 100 years, that's history. No matter how you slice it, whether you like it or not, that's something you have to talk about. And it was quite the compelling World Series to watch. It was a 7-game series. There was the deluge in Game 7 that goes into extra innings. Of course, Ben Zobrist is named MVP. And this photo here, I think, to me, still encapsulates the joy of this happening. This is Chris Bryant throwing the final out. And the guy who, I should really look and see who got this photo, because it's absolutely perfect. He has that smile on his face like, we've done it. This is over. And I think that just really captures how this really, it really did, I want to say, just grab the attention of the entire city and really of the entire country. And you could even probably argue the world, because again, you don't have a lot of professional sports teams that last 100+ years, let alone continue to play and go that long. And I mean, it's almost like you would think they would fall into a championship somewhere in those 100 years. But no such luck. And that, as some people have said, was like the last great sports story in some ways. Now, I don't know. I think as long as we keep playing, there will always be great sports stories. So maybe not. But with that, I've hit number 10. I'm anxious to hear any questions you might have. I'll do my best to answer anything.
Yep, here I am. I have quite a few questions that came in while you were speaking, and a lot of interesting questions. So let me start. The first one was, after the Black Sox scandal, what is the history of cheating and gambling in both the Cubs and the White Sox?
That's pretty good. As far as I know, there's not a great deal more about gambling and cheating. There is, if you know, looking at other cheating scandals like the steroids era and things of that nature, there is definitely representatives from both sides of town that came out in that. Most famously, Sammy Sosa. As far as game fixing, that really, you know, that really becomes hard to do, because baseball really tries its best to have that eradicated from the game. It's after that 1920 season where, famously, if you go into pretty much every major league clubhouse, there's a big sign that says "No betting on baseball." As it, you know, so there, and there's still a few times where that is brought up, and people are accused of fixing games and things like that, but not nearly on the scale of, I mean, the World Series, even though it was 20 years, not even quite 20 years old, had already gained sort of like a revered place, and nothing like that has been the same.
Okay. Number 2 question, Mike noted that the 1905 White Sox photo that you showed had fewer players in the photo. And what was the rule about the number of players back then?
That is a good question. I'm not 100% sure on that one. I think they don't establish the like the limit on players until later into the 20th century. It seems like a reform that probably came in that same 1920s era. And when minor leagues really, because in that time, like in the aughts, there's no real structured minor leagues like will come in the 1920s and 30s, where you could shuttle players back and forth and things like that. So there wasn't probably as much of a, a stricture on how many people could be there or not. So that's probably what it is. I don't know for sure, though. That'd be something interesting to take a look at.
It is interesting. Before I ask the next question, could you unshare your slideshow screen? Perfect.
Yeah,
all right, excellent. The third question came from Celeste, and as a cultural historian, she asks, do you have any thoughts on disco demolition?
I do. It's one of those interesting moments in Chicago baseball history, specifically White Sox, that I'm amazed that it's still commemorated every year. But it's still brought up every August. You will see someone talk about, there'll be a short column. And then I think it was 2 years ago, that sound about right, that it was the 30th anniversary. That there was quite a lot about it, and there's been films about it. There's been, it's amazing how well it's been, how long it's held its kind of fascination to people. It really was just a stunt, and it just went really bad, and that it's still remembered. There's some interesting stuff about the cultural significance of it too. Somebody wrote, I think it was just an article, about how there was a certain amount of racial discussion about it because it was disco, which was associated with African Americans largely, and this idea that taking back real rock and roll and all these kind of things. It was a pretty interesting piece. I wish I had the author's name on the top of my tongue, but I can't quite get it. But it was an interesting look at how that played out, especially South Side of Chicago has its own interesting, for lack of a better word, history with racial tension. And that seems definitely part of that for sure.
All right, we're going to take it in a different direction. How did Jackson pick up his nickname, Shoeless Joe?
I used to know this much better than I do right now. I think he was, in fact, playing in a minor league team without shoes. And that's where he got the name. It was something right along those lines. He came from a pretty poor background. And that's where it came from. Or maybe he kicked off his shoes while playing because they didn't fit right, something along those lines. Sorry, I don't have a better one for that.
Okay. Can you talk about the influence Harry Carey had on the popularity of Chicago baseball?
Ooh, that was in my honorable mentions if I had time. Yes, Harry Carey had a huge impact on Chicago baseball, not just the Cubs. He was the White Sox broadcaster for a number of years. He was actually at Disco Demolition at one point trying to calm the crowd with renditions of "Take Me Out of the Ball Game," which was already a staple of his broadcasts, and he tried to do that during that and get the crowd into it, and all that didn't work. But he was a loved broadcaster for the South Side, and he, of course, has a falling out with Jerry Reinsdorf, partly because the White Sox were looking to move the majority of their games to pay television, which was absolutely crazy at the time. And he got an offer from the Cubs to be on this other thing on WGN, which had a large reach even before cable TV and the Superstation idea. And he went to the Cubs right at the right time. I think his first year was, it was in 83, maybe 84. But definitely 84, the Cubs have a huge successful season. That's where he does the commercial for Budweiser. He's Budman, Cubs fan, and all that. And then, of course, it just takes off on the North Side, much more so than he ever was on the South Side, for sure. He was, he was the voice of Chicago baseball, really, for one or the other teams through the 1970s until he passes away. So it's really, he has a lot to do with Chicago baseball.
Great. This is kind of a fun question that I didn't ask this question, but it's something that I've always been interested in. Do you have any thoughts on the amount of superstitious rituals there are in baseball?
I love them. I think every sport has their thing. LeBron like clapping the chalk and all that kind of stuff before, but baseball outdoes them all, from not talking during a no-hitter to not touching the foul lines as you go in and out, to what players chew. I had when I worked at Wrigley Field, one time I was, and he didn't tell me this at the time, but I sat in the bullpen next to a guy by the name of Turk Wendell. Anyway, he was known for all of his superstitions. He wouldn't touch the foul lines. He brushed his teeth in between every inning that he was pitching. He had something with black licorice that I can't remember now, but there was just so many. And I don't know why baseball players seem to fall into it, especially because and really athletes in general, because they're so finely tuned and trained that no superstition is going to change that.
Mm-hmm.
But I think part of it is that idea of, well, what makes you comfortable in that moment works.
Yep.
You know what I mean? Like, if I twirl the bat 3 times, I do better. And once it becomes part of the mental makeup, you know, like a guy who wasn't a Cub for very long, but Nomar Garcia-Pera, he would step out of the batter's box every time and do the same ritual, just his gloves, do this, do that. And I think it just gets down to almost like a, you know, a ritual or a mantra kind of aspect to it.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Okay, good. I'm going to ask you one more question, and then we'll wrap up and let people, there were a few more questions that came in. I'm going to let people talk to you about those.
Okay.
The last one, were you rooting for the Cleveland Indians in 2016?
Good question. I was, yeah. Mostly though, I was rooting for my dad, because he was 10 years old when they won their last World Series in 1948. And my brother, who has never seen the Indians win a championship. So it was more that than rooting against the Cubs, believe it or not. I know many Cubs fans don't believe me. So, because I have a lot of friends. I think if you live in Chicago, you have more friends who are Cubs fans than White Sox fans. We tend to be outnumbered, and but I was really hopeful for my dad and brother that they might get to see that. So, and well, no such luck.
Good. Well, thanks very much. That was very informative and very interesting. And I know that people are probably dying to have a little chat with you.
Sure.
So
I saw some people answering some of those questions too. So
yeah,
that's
they have some good questions for you. So let's open it up to everybody. And I hope that people have worn some of their apparel